So, we're living through what I believe is going to be remembered as one of the greatest hysterias in American history. I'm not sure what they're going to call it exactly, but for now, I refer to it as the Great Trump Derangement Hysteria. It's often hard to know what to do when you wake up in the morning and you find yourself in one of these inexplicable manias. People are losing their jobs. There's violence at rallies. And free speech is being shut down. Your rights are being taken away. And it's very natural to ask the question, what are we supposed to do? What would history look back and say, those are the people that got it? Those are the people that figured it out. They did the right thing. They saw it while they were in it. It's always going to be obvious later. Hindsight is 20/20. And I think one of the most productive things you can always do is to go back and look for a historical context, which is one reason why I'm so fond of looking at the Salem witch trials. It's a small microcosm of how hysterias come about, how they manifest, how they hit a climax point, and then collapse back in on themselves. Because in the end, there is hope. So to give a brief background on the Salem witch trials, these were a series of hearings and prosecutions of people accused of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts between February 1692 and May 1693. More than 200 people were accused, 19 of whom were found guilty and executed by hanging, 14 women and 5 men. One other man, Giles Corey, was crushed to death for refusing to plead, and at least 5 people died in jail. It was the deadliest witch hunt in the history of colonial North America. Salem Village was known for its fractious population, who had many internal disputes, and for disputes between the village and Salem town. Arguments about property lines, grazing rights, and church privileges were rife, and neighbors considered the population as quarrelsome. Though the prior minister's fate and the level of contention in Salem Village were valid reasons for caution in accepting the position, Reverend Parris increased the village's divisions by delaying his acceptance. He did not seem able to settle his new parishioners' disputes by deliberately seeking out iniquitous behavior in his congregation and making church members in good standing suffer public penance for small infractions. He contributed significantly to the tension within the village. Its bickering increased unabated. Historian Marianne Starkey suggests that in this atmosphere, serious conflict may have been inevitable. There were 4 execution dates, with one person executed on June 10th, 1692, 5 executed on July 19th, 1692, another 5 executed on August 19th, 1692, and 8 on September 22nd, 1692. One, Mary Bradbury, age 77, managed to escape with the help of family and friends, and I want you to keep that one in mind. Another, Giles Corey, was an 81-year-old farmer from the southeast end of Salem who refused to enter a plea when he came to trial in September. The judges applied an archaic form of punishment in which stones were piled on his chest until he could no longer breathe. After 2 days, Corey died without entering a plea. His refusal to plead is usually explained as a way of preventing his estate from being confiscated by the crown, but according to historian Chadwick Hansen, much of Corey's property had already been seized, and he had made a will in prison. His death was a protest against the methods of the court. A contemporary critic of the trials, Robert Califf, wrote, "Giles Corey pleaded not guilty to his indictment, but would not put himself upon trial by the jury, they having cleared none upon trial, and knowing there would be the same witnesses against him, rather chose to undergo what death they would put him to." Much, not all, of the evidence used against the accused was known as spectral evidence, or the testimony of the afflicted who claimed to see the apparition or the shape of the person who was allegedly afflicting them. The theological dispute that ensued about the use of this evidence was based on whether a person had to give permission to the devil for his or her shape to be used to afflict. Opponents claim that the devil was able to use anyone's shape to afflict people, but the court contended that the devil could not use a person's shape without that person's permission. Therefore, when the afflicted claimed to see the apparition of a specific person, that was accepted as evidence that the accused had been complicit with the devil. I want to read a passage from John Fisk's Witchcraft in Salem Village, which further describes this use of spectral evidence in court. The next was Rebecca Nurse. She was one of 3 sisters, daughters of William Town of Yarmouth in England. Her 2 sisters, who were arrested soon after her, were Mary Easty and Sarah Cloyce. With their husbands, they were all persons held in highest esteem, but an ancient village feud had left a grudge against them in some revengeful bosoms. Half a century before, there had been a fierce dispute between parties from Salem and from Topsfield, who had settled in the border region between the 2 townships. The dispute related to the possession of certain lots of land. It had grown more and more complicated, and it had engendered hard feelings between the Putnams on one side and the Easties and Towns on the other. Besides this, Rebecca Nurse and her husband had become obnoxious to the Putnams and to the Reverend Mr. Parris from reasons connected with the church dispute. There was evidently a method in the madness of the accusing girls. Rebecca Nurse was arrested 2 days after the committal of Martha Corey. The appearance of this venerable and venerated lady before the magistrates caused most profound sensation. Her numerous children and grandchildren stood high in public esteem. Her husband was one of the most honored persons in the community, herself a model of every virtue. As she stood there, delicate and fragile in figure, with those honest eyes that looked one full in the face, that soft gray hair and dainty white muslin kerchief, one marvels what fiend can have possessed those young girls that they did not shamefastly hold their peace. In the intervals of question and answer, they went into fits, as usual. When the magistrate, Hawthorne, became visibly affected by the lady's clear and straightforward answers, the relentless Mrs. Putnam broke out with a violence dreadful to behold. "Did you not bring the black man with you? Did you not bid me tempt God and die? How often have you eaten and drunk your own damnation?" At this outburst, like the horrible snarl of a lioness, the poor old lady raised her hands toward heaven and cried, "O Lord, help me!" Whereupon all the afflicted girls were grievously vexed. Hathorne thought that their spasms were caused by a mysterious influence emanating from good wife nurse's lifted hands, and so his heart was hardened toward her. Mary Walcott cried out that the prisoner was biting her, and then showed marks of teeth upon her wrist. Thus the abominable scene went on till Rebecca Nurse was remanded to jail to await her trial. So I want you to picture this scene. An innocent, upstanding woman with a respected family, and these little girls twisting and screaming on the floor. And then, to add to the scene, there's a woman in the courtroom, and she bites down on her own arm when nobody is looking, and then holds it up and says, "Look, there are teeth marks on my arm." That proves she's sending spirits to bite me. This is how crazy it was. This is the level of hysteria. And I can't think of that disgusting charade. Reminds me of the behavior of Blasey Ford during the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, where she stood up hand to God. And although she could not remember the time, place, year, street, who was present, when, where, why, or any relevant detail, or any detail that could possibly corroborate her story, she said, "But I remember that it was him." And then you had Ellen DeGeneres come out and say, "I had a similar assault in my youth." And that's exactly what it's like. That for some reason, sexual assault is a completely unique experience in the pantheon of human experiences, where absolutely every possible detail that could matter is blocked out, except for the person who you want to keep off the court, to keep the Supreme Court liberal and not conservative. Of course, the political motivations don't matter. Of course, we should believe all women. And women believed her. People flocked to that nonsense. There's people to this day that will swear that she is telling the truth. So let's continue on with the witch trials. In August, grand juries indicted George Burroughs, Mary Eastie, Martha Corey, and George Jacobs Sr. Trial juries convicted Martha Carrier, George Jacobs Sr., George Burroughs, John Willard, Elizabeth Proctor, and John Proctor. Elizabeth Proctor was given a temporary stay of execution because she was pregnant. On August 19, 1692, Martha Carrier, George Jacobs Sr., George Burroughs, John Willard, and John Proctor were executed. Mr. Burroughs was carried in a cart with others through the streets of Salem to execution. When he was upon the ladder, he made a speech for the clearing of his innocency, with such solemn and serious expressions as were to the admiration of all present. His prayer, which he concluded by repeating the Lord's Prayer, as witches were not supposed to be able to recite, was so well worded and uttered with such composedness, as such fervency of spirit, as was very affecting and drew tears from many, so that it seemed to some that the spectators would hinder the execution. The accuser said the black man, the devil, stood and dictated to him. As soon as he was turned off, hanged, Mr. Cotton Mather, being mounted upon a horse, addressed himself to the people, partly to declare that he, meaning Mr. Burroughs, was no ordained minister, partly to possess the people of his guilt, saying that the devil often had been transformed into the angel of light. And this did somewhat appease the people, and the executions went on. When Mr. Burroughs was cut down, he was dragged by a halter to a hole between the rocks about 2 feet deep, his shirt and his breeches being pulled off, and an old pair of trousers of one executed put on his lower parts, He was so put in together with Willard and Carrier that one of his hands and his chin and a foot of one of them was left uncovered. Now notice here, during Mr. Burroughs' execution, there were people having second thoughts. In fact, we can see throughout this whole story, people knew this was political. People were taking advantage of political situations. They were using the accusation of witchcraft to right property disagreements. Now, just to give some perspective, the town, Salem town and village at the time of the witch trials, we don't know exactly how many people lived there, but an estimate for the population of the area was about 2,000 residents, with the population of Salem village numbering between 500 and 600 residents. So think about that for a moment. The village itself only had 500 people. Remember that old woman that was able to escape with the help of her family? Think if just a few people had actually stood up to the powers that be at this time. It wouldn't have taken violence, merely a show of power. Think about it. 2,000 people total in the area, but only 500 in the town. So the jail was being manned by one guy at night, maybe two? They certainly didn't have a standing guard of 30 men. Okay, so you have 5 to 600. Let's say 500 people lived in the village. Well, 250 of them at this point in time were probably children. So now you have 250 adults in town. Well, 125 of them were probably women. That means if 12 strong men had stood up to the jailers with nothing more than farm implements, not using violence, but simply saying, "This hysteria ends now," they could have stopped these hangings. They could have stopped these tragedies, and you can see that people understood. There was many people that believed that this was all just political. They were just afraid to speak up one by one because they knew if they did, they were the next target of the accusing girls. You're talking about a little village with 125 men. Well, think about it. A good 25 of those men were probably old. There was probably only 100 good, strong men in that village. 10 of them, 12 of them, 20 of them standing together could have put an end to one of these great tragedies, but they didn't. They hunkered down and they hoped that it would pass them by. They did nothing. They meekly, like lambs, followed the law when the law had been corrupted, when the authority was evil, and plainly evil for everybody to see, even by their own standards. A witch, a devil, cannot recite the Lord's Prayer, and here you have people being executed, reciting the Lord's Prayer. So I bring this up to show that the efforts of the little person, the small efforts matter, and these are the times that they matter most. And I want to read an article that really emphasizes how conservatives in California are doing it and doing it right. Headline is, "Shocker. Trump is raising more money in California than nearly all of his Democratic challengers." Conservatives tend to write off California as a lost cause these days, and in terms of whether or not a Republican presidential candidate can actually win the state anytime soon, the odds are certainly against it. Democrats have a solid lock on governorship and a supermajority in the state assembly. Democrats run all of the major cities. Democrats rule all the urban areas. But something is stirring that is favorable to the GOP, and in particular to POTUS Donald Trump, as evidenced by the latest 2020 campaign fundraising figures from the Golden State. According to Call Matters, the president has already raised $3.2 million in the so-called resistance state, more than all but two of his major Democrat challengers. This may come as a surprise to the president, the national media, and more than a few Californians, but there are plenty of Trump supporters in the resistance state too. And since the beginning of the year, they've been spending a lot of money to keep the president in the White House. New campaign finance statistics show that President Donald Trump raised $3.2 million, more money from the California donor class than all of his Democratic challengers but two. Not only that, but the Trump campaign collected more from itemized small donors, those who gave in increments of less than $100 at the time, than anyone else in the field. The president bested even Democratic contender Bernie Sanders in the small donor sweepstakes. Campaign figures show Senator Kamala Harris taking in the lion's share of donations from California, followed by South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. But the president is a solid third place and well ahead of Joe Biden, Senator Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. And here's something else. Trump is, by far, well ahead of all Democrats in small money donations, those amounting to $100 or less, meaning his support among the, quote, people is a lot stronger than any single Democratic candidate, including Harris and Buttigieg, who are obviously benefiting from wealthy donors. In fact, those two aren't even close. Sanders and Warren are behind the president at small money contributions. Remember that these contributions are only reported by federal election regulations if they come from donors who have given at least $200 over the course of the year. Anyone who is giving less than $100 but still showing up in these published figures is almost by definition a regular contributor. Giving $25 here and $50 there, this sizable network of disaffected California Republicans is providing a steady stream of small but reliable cash infusions to the president's re-election campaign. Many political experts also see small donors as a good proxy for voter enthusiasm. Some political analysts have suggested that the president may make a play for California, given Democrat policies throughout the state that cater to illegal aliens over U.S. citizens and have created vast enclaves of homeless camps replete with filth, disease, drug use, and rodent infestations. This story made national headlines because many people that didn't have much to give but knew that they had to do something pushed back in the bluest state in the country. Now, I can sympathize with them. Living in Washington State myself, if you know Washington, King County carries this state. It's all Seattle. All the liberals are in Seattle. But everyone has given up hope. Everyone just believes it will go blue, and it will always go blue, and they despair. They don't look for ways, constructive ways, of pushing back. And I think the Republicans in California are onto something. I don't know if you're familiar with I-1639 that recently passed here in Washington State. There's a video on it on my channel. But it passed. There was 1.8 million yes votes and 1.2 million no votes. We went from being one of the most free and open states with regards to gun ownership to having some of the most draconian gun laws in the country. And this was a difference of only 600,000 votes. To put that number in perspective, it's estimated that there's about 1.3 million unregistered potential voters in Washington State, or otherwise more than double the 600,000 that made up the difference in passing this law. Now I wonder how many of those people had just given in to despair. How many of them are like people I know that just assumes the state is blue and there's no stopping these left-wing agendas. because we saw in the case of the witch trials, if you don't push back, there's no telling what tragedies will befall us before the hysteria runs out of gas. Now, I'll link below to this book, Witchcraft in Salem Village, by John Fisk. It's the first book that I ever narrated on this channel, and I think it's one of the most interesting topics out there to study. But I want to read some closing statements by the author that there is a reason to hold out hope, and that hysterias and manias do not go on forever. He writes, "The execution of Mary Easty, Martha Corey, and their 6 companions was the last scene in the tragedy. Further trials were held, but there were no more executions, and early in 1693, all the prisoners were set free. As to the cause of this sudden collapse in the frenzy, we may say that it came as such collapses always come, when humanity has been outraged more than it will bear. Why did the guillotine stop its work in 1794, just after the fall of Robespierre? The men who overthrew him were not much better than himself, but the state of things had come to be unendurable. Such periods of furious excitement inevitably lead up to a moment of reaction, and the suddenness and completeness of the reaction is apt to be proportionate to the intensity and ferocity of the excitement. The reign of terror in Salem Village was due to a temporary destruction of confidence. Everybody became afraid of his neighbors, and there is nothing so pitiless as fear. But many long ages of social discipline, based upon mutual confidence, without which human society could not exist, have made that sentiment so strong and tough that it cannot be suppressed for more than a short time. The feeling with which people endured the sight of Rebecca Nurse and George Burroughs and Martha Corey hanged like common felons was a feeling of tension that must soon give way. The accusing girls did not appreciate this point. They became overweeningly bold and aimed too high. Increase Mather, president of Harvard College, had expressed his disapproval of the methods of the court, and a member of his family was accused. Then the girls cried out against Reverend Samuel Willard, pastor of the Old South Church in Boston, a man of as much eminence in his day as the late Philip Brooks. They even assailed Lady Phipps, the governor's wife, who condemned their proceedings and expressed sympathy with the victims. In these instances, the girls struck too high. The same Stoughton and Hathorne, who could take for granted the guilt of Martha Corey, could entertain no such thoughts about Mr. Willard, and when some of the girls mentioned his name, they were sharply rebuked and told to hold their tongues. Their final and most fatal mistake was made in October, when they accused Mrs. Hale, wife of the minister in Beverly, a lady known throughout the colony for her noble Christian character. The vile accusation opened the eyes of her husband, who had been active in the pursuit of witches. He instantly faced about, began to oppose the whole prosecution, and confessed that he had been deceived. This was a fatal blow to the witch hunters, and the effect was presently enhanced when some high-spirited persons in Andover, on being accused of witchcraft, retorted by bringing an action for defamation of character with heavy damages. This marked the end of the panic, and from that time people began to be quick in throwing off the whole witchcraft delusion.